Good evening, and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Myron Belkine, treasurer of the club and chair of its International Correspondence Committee, which has organized this evening's event. Tonight, you might say, is the culmination of a 5-year-long campaign by our committee to fulfill a mission of enhancing the international activities and events at the National Press Club. For the first time ever, the response has been so great that we arranged an overflow room to accommodate everyone, and we thank all of you for coming. We are truly appreciative for you coming together for the largest ever event organized by our committee under these circumstances. The credit for this evening goes to Jan DePlane, a member of our committee, who proposed that we have a marquee event on Islam pegged to the publication of the book Religion, Terror, and Error, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Challenge of Spiritual Engagement by Douglas Johnston, the president and founder of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. As many of you know, whenever Jan has a proposal, it is difficult to say no to the idea or to her. And once again, Jan, I'm glad I listened to you. Where are you, Jan? Our thanks. Our first goal was to have an outstanding moderator of a very distinguished panel. And our first and only choice was Sally Quinn, who herself, as you know, is a very distinguished Washington Post journalist and author, who 5 years ago founded the On Faith blog at the Washington Post, based on the premise, in her words, that religion is the most pervasive yet least understood topic in global life. How appropriate it is that our discussion tonight will focus on how religious considerations and faith-based diplomacy can contribute to the solution of conflicts around the world. And how timely it is that we are meeting exactly 24 hours after President Barack Obama delivered a major policy speech related to the U.S. role in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thank you again for coming. I would like to call first on Douglas Johnston, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the past month as we met and planned this event. Doug on Monday said, Myron, we're going to make history at the National Press Club with this event. And because of the timeliness of it and the content of it, and being an objective journalist, I'll have to say I agree with his assessment. And again, the timeliness of it could not be better. And so, Doug, I would like to call on you to talk about the book, to introduce a first-time ever shown video about the Pakistan Madrasa project of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And after he finishes, I'll then introduce the other panelists one by one, and they will say a few words, and then I will ask Sally Quinn to moderate the panel discussion tonight. Doug, over to you.
Thank you, Myron, to you and your committee for welcoming us into your home. And also like to thank Jan, as others have, for making this all possible, and Sally and our distinguished panelists for agreeing to participate, and all of you for coming out tonight. My hope is that this event can be a bit of a wake-up call with respect to our country's general neglect of religion in its practice of foreign policy. And it goes beyond neglect. We don't even understand some of the basics. For example, when an American says secular, the average Muslim hears godless, when what was intended was freedom to worship as you please. And the godless interpretation, one may conclude offhand that this has to do with the cultural image that we project, which often is every bit as offensive to us as it is to any Muslim. But it goes much deeper than that. It goes back to the fact that the American Revolution predated the French Revolution. When our forefathers came over to this country, they left a country in which absolute monarchy had made the transition to constitutional monarchy, and religion had survived that process. So they leaned on it rather heavily when they conducted this American experiment. A few years later, 1789, with the French Revolution, it was a very different scene, because the church, Catholic Church especially, was seen to be complicit with the monarchy and all the ills that the people were facing. And so, unlike in America with an Edmund Burke approach, where you preserve the wisdom of the ages and reform at the margins, there it was more like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They threw the baby out with the bathwater and specifically purged religion to make way for secular humanism. So that's why you see this difference in understanding of what that word means. This was all driven home to me several years ago when we invited 6 top leaders from Sudan and Kashmir, both areas that we were working in at the time, to the National Prayer Breakfast. And 5 of those 6 were Muslims. And after the breakfast and the 2 days of activity surrounding it, they all remarked on how absolutely surprised they were to see the degree to which religious faith underpins our democratic processes. And they said that they felt much closer as a result. So it seems supremely ironic that here we are, one of the most religious countries on the face of the planet, and yet we are so at sea and unable to deal with the religious imperatives that permeate today's geopolitical landscape. And there are several reasons for this. First is the fact that we've allowed ourselves to use our separation of church and state as an excuse for not doing our homework to understand how religion informs the worldviews and political aspirations of others. Second is our long-held commitment to the rational actor model of decision-making and its exclusion of religion from the policymaker's calculus. And third is the fact that all of us seem to fall into this trap of compartmentalizing our religion to the point where we're almost embarrassed to talk about it in the workplace. Indeed, whenever industry or government hears the very word religion, they run for the hills for fear of being accused of favoring one faith tradition over another. So it was in recognition of all this that I wrote this book. And the book, in many respects, is a how-to book. It's how to incorporate religious considerations into the practice of U.S. foreign policy. How to move beyond the rational actor model of decision-making to a process that accommodates non-state actors and non-rational factors like religion. And it's also a how-to book to move to a new leadership paradigm that will serve the United States better in the multipolar world that awaits us. The opportunities for going it alone are fast disappearing. And in the course of all that, we lay out a strategy for how the U.S. can deal more effectively with the causal factors underlying religious extremism. Most of what we've done to date has been about addressing symptoms, and we just need desperately to come to grips with cause. Well, here what we do is we take a hard look at existing assets that we have to see which of them could be usefully redirected to help deal with this problem, and then to look at whatever new capabilities might be required to bridge the remaining gap. Now, foremost among existing assets is the American Muslim community, which can play a very important role in informing our foreign policy and public diplomacy with a more nuanced understanding of Islam, so that we don't end up on the wrong side of the law of unintended consequences quite so much. They can also help bridge relations with other Muslim communities overseas, many of them in areas of strategic consequence to the United States. The second capability are our military chaplains, who already bridge church and state and have many of the skills of dealing with different religions. But with additional training and with expanded rules of engagement, by forming relationships of trust with local religious leaders overseas, they will become much better equipped to understand what's going on and how to advise their commanders on what the cultural or religious implications are of decisions that are about to be taken. And finally, there's the NGO community, of which we are a part, non-governmental organizations. NGOs enjoy a flexible, apolitical posture that's can be very, very helpful, particularly in dealing with the transnational aspects of the threats that we face. Amongst new capabilities that are required, first is realigning the executive branch. And here we offer 4 different organizational structures for the State Department that would enable them to be dealing with religion in the natural course of doing business every day. Fundamental to all of those structures is the establishment of a new position called religion attaché. Now, this would be someone who's been trained probably with a theological background and others, but who understand the nuances and who can deal with the complexities of many of these religious issues that most other folks can't deal with. And the naysayers will tell you by establishing such a position, that's the quickest way to marginalize it and the function that it represents. And I disagree with that strongly. I believe if you were to place these people in the political section of our embassies and you gave them comparable status and responsibilities as we do our political military officers, these political religious officers could start having an impact and an influence on our decisions quite quickly. Second would be the fact that we need to address the political ambiguities surrounding the separation of church and state. There's a whole chapter devoted to that. There's a whole chapter devoted to each one of these things that I'm talking about. But there, the answer is quite simple, straightforward. The President of the United States just needs to turn to his Justice Department and says, make the legal case for us to use religious engagement as a component of our foreign policy. And then it would be very helpful to get endorsement of both houses of Congress. But that's readily done. And if we did that, that would enable our political leaders and military leaders who feel intimidated by these political ambiguities from taking the kinds of actions needed to deal with the religious dimensions of the threats that they're facing. Thirdly, we need an effective conflict prevention capability. And here the book suggests that the formation of conflict prevention research teams that would go into areas, trouble spots before things have heated up, assess very carefully what needs to be done, come back with policy prescriptions, and help us to enable us to nip these things in the bud before they turn into conflict. The ounce of prevention is worth many pounds of gain. So finally, we need to support what we call a process of organic suasion, which suggests change and healing from within. And implicit in this is the fact that one would have to believe that within Islamic traditions and sacred texts, that one can find the wherewithal to counter illegitimate warfare being conducted in its name. And probably one of the better examples of this business of organic suasion is a project that we've been doing that you heard made earlier, and that's reforming the madrasas in Pakistan, including those that gave birth to the Taliban. Now, for 7 years we've been on the ground there trying to deal with these madrasa leaders and to turn things around. Few of us in the West, however, understand the illustrious history of these schools. If you read the media, all you get is that these are seedbeds of terrorism. Well, once upon a time, in the Middle Ages through the 16th century, they were without peer as institutions of higher learning in the world at the time. It was only European exposure to them that gave birth to our own university system. And you would be stunned at how many of the traditions and mores of academe trace their roots back to the madrasas, starting with the mortar boards and tassels you wear at graduation. So they've enjoyed this great history, this time in the sun, but then under the impact of British colonialism, they feared for the loss of their Muslim identity. So they sought to purge themselves of all subjects that were either secular or Western in nature, to the point where the majority of them today are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Now, our goals have been twofold. First is to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences with a heavy emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. We don't pretend to touch the religious core. That would be far too sensitive. But our assumption is if we do a good job in both of these areas, this can smooth a lot of the rough edges. And all of the evidence that we've seen suggests that that's a valid assumption. Second, probably more important goal, is to transform the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills amongst the students. When we first began, if a student so much as raised his hand in class, he was punished for disrespect. And why this is so important is you'll find these youngsters as young as the age of 12 who've memorized the Quran from cover to cover, and they're essentially clueless as to what it means because they've had to memorize it in Arabic, and their first language is Urdu. But along comes the local militant who misappropriates a little scripture, as all religions are guilty of doing from time to time, to recruit these kids to their cause. And these children have absolutely no ability to question or to challenge. They just go do as they're asked. So this is why it's so very important. Thus far, at this point, after 7 years, we've engaged a little over 2,700 madrasa leaders from about 1,633 madrasas. That is, you know, some would look at that and say, well, that's pretty impressive. It is, but it isn't. There's about 20,000 of these madrasas. But most of the ones we've dealt with have been in the radical areas, so we really feel we have sufficient momentum to take this to scale across the country. And securing the resources to do that is a major challenge at this point. One can legitimately ask, why have we succeeded where all others have failed? And there's about 4 reasons for this. First is ownership. We've done this in such a way that the madrasa leaders feel it's their reform project and not something imposed from the outside, which means that they have a lot of say in the change process. These are bright people, contrary to the stereotypes you'll read in the media. And I just want to take a moment to read for you the initial paragraph in our teacher awareness module, which was crafted by a madrasa leader. I quote, "I have come to a frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. My personal approach creates the climate. My daily mood makes the weather. As a teacher, I have a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it's my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized." Pretty powerful stuff. Second ingredient in the success is appealing to their own heritage, not only the heritage of their schools, which, as I said before, is illustrious, but going back in time 1,000 years ago, when many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences took place under Islam, including religious tolerance at a time when Christianity was woefully intolerant. The more they hear this and internalize it, the taller they walk, and the more they think, hey, maybe we can do better. Thirdly, and I think most important of all, is we ground all suggested change in Islamic principles so that they can genuinely feel they're becoming better Muslims in the process, and they are. And the fourth ingredient is a posture of humility, driven by 2 things. First is our understanding of the fact that it was the United States that was principally responsible for planting the seeds of jihad in the madrasas in the first place. We were trying to grow holy warriors to evict the godless Soviets out of Afghanistan. When that was done, we left. Many of you have seen Charlie Wilson's War. That's pretty accurate. And now we're back, and they're doing what we trained them to do. They just changed targets. So this is, again, the law of unintended consequences. But the other aspect of the humility is if you think about Proverbs 18, verse 13, which says, "Only a fool judges a matter before he hears it." And what we try to do is, not just hear what they have to say, but make the effort to try to hear through their ears what we're saying, to think about that in advance, and that really serves us well. I would say, in summarizing here, that this work that's with the madrasas, as far as I'm concerned, there is nothing going on either on or off the battlefield that's any more strategic than this. This is the asymmetric counter to the asymmetric threat. It gets at the ideas behind the guns. And one short anecdote to illustrate how that happens. A little over a year ago, we were conducting a workshop for 16 madrasas surrounding the Swat Valley. And toward the end of that workshop, one of the madrasa leaders stood up, and turned out he was the commander in Lashkar-e-Taiba, who are the folks that brought you the attacks on Mumbai. He says, I came here for one reason and one reason only. I came here to discredit everything you have to say. He says, but now I find myself standing here full of rage. Rage because for 26 years I've been teaching the Quran, studying it and teaching it the same way it was taught to me. He says, for the first time in my life, I feel like I've experienced the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent. He says, I now see that the right way to advance Islam is through peace, not through conflict. He said, I'm going to change what I tell my students, and I'm going to tell them why. And we came back a month later. Ozzie Hussain came back, our project director, and sure enough, this leader was doing exactly as he promised. We also happened to have a CNN team along. They'd been after us for 3 years to document some of our work. And he says it to CNN, for God and the whole world to hear. And it just bowled me over, because you look cross-eyed in the Swat Valley when the Taliban was in charge, and you'd lose your head. And here's a guy, I guess he got cut some slack because he was a terrorist commander, but he's still alive. But it's amazing, because we find that in working with these madrasa leaders, once you penetrate, work your way past that veneer of rage and hostility, not only do they get it, once they engage, they not only get it, but a lot of them become champions of it at great personal risk to themselves. In conclusion, I would just like to read a couple of paragraphs from the conclusion of the book. You know, the whole book is about change. And change is never easy, as we are reminded by Niccolo Machiavelli some 5 centuries ago. I quote, "It ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them. Confirming the above and indicative of the inertia to be overcome is the following observation by a conservative commentator in response to recent attempts by the United States to reach out to regimes that were previously deemed off limits. I quote, "The world is in fact a dangerous place, inhabited by fundamentalist regimes, crusading radicals, and amoral power seekers. Realism would dictate that we be pessimists and cynics, never trusting until verified, basing our foreign policy on the past actions of our opponents and not on their sweet words or our even sweeter hopes. Well, history suggests the need to heed such advice and above all to proceed with our eyes open. It does not, however, negate the fact that the world is changing and that we need to anticipate that change by making the necessary adjustments to our prospective role and leadership style. For a new paradigm to be accepted, it needs only to be provably better than its predecessor. There is no requirement that it explain all of the facts or situations with which it is confronted, only that it does a better job of predicting and responding to them than any of its competitors. Crisis often proliferates new discovery, and it's typically the failure of existing rules, think rational actor, that leads to a search for new ones. Because the stakes are so extraordinarily high in today's interconnected world, we can neither afford the crisis nor the failure of rules as a prerequisite to making the necessary change. The time has come. The future is now. Thank you very much.
It's my personal pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ambassador James K. Glassman, who is the founding executive director of the George W. Bush Institute and moderator of Ideas in Action, a weekly series on public policy issues aired on more than 100 public television stations around the country. Mr. Glassman has had an active career in politics and as a journalist and publisher. He served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs from June 2008 to January 2009, leading the government-wide international strategic communications effort. And it was during that time that I was fortunate to be invited to a reception and dinner at the Indonesian ambassador's residence. And it was the first time I heard Mr. Glassman speak. And I really, even speaking objectively, I was so impressed by his communication skills and his content and his delivery. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, James, you must have put a lot of preparation into that speech. And he said, Myron, I didn't know I was going to speak until I was asked to stand up and say a few words. And I said, wow, I want you to come and be a guest of honor at one of the signature lunches of the National Press Club. And a few months later, he did so, and he made an excellent impression in the way he delivered a meaningful speech and handled the most difficult part of the Press Club lunches, which is the Q&A. Ambassador Glassman, it's my pleasure for the second time to welcome you to the National Press Club and to also welcome Mrs. Glassman.
Thanks, Myron. Thank you, Myron. I don't know if I like that kind of build-up. You know, when you're Undersecretary of State, people come to visit you a lot. They have ideas. In some cases, they're looking for money. In some cases, they simply want you to get behind their ideas. And never during my short but quite intense tenure at the State Department was I presented with a more compelling idea, and not just an idea, but a real live program that was making change than what Doug and Ozzie brought to me and to others at the State Department regarding the Madrasa project. This is a very modest man over here, but he is truly an exceptional man. A leader in the U.S. Navy, spent a lot of time on submarines, and he writes in this book, as he began to spend time and think, as I'm sure you have plenty of time to do when you're on a submarine, I came to believe that if mankind is to have any hope of realizing its full potential, it will need to develop better ways to resolve its differences. I began to devote time and energy to this theme. As a Christian inspired by the challenge to be a peacemaker, I became convinced that although religious principles and matters of faith are all too often co-opted by power politics to aid and abet conflict, these same principles, if properly applied, could actually play a key role in its prevention and resolution. And this is Doug Johnston's big idea, and it's a very important idea, and it's reflected in this book. It's a provocative book, it's an inspiring book, and it is an extremely rich book. I mean, every page is packed with interesting ideas and facts. And so I'm honored that Doug has asked me to share a few comments about the book today. My only complaint is that he didn't write this book earlier while I was still serving at the State Department, because I think I would have had a much keener understanding into ideas about structure, for example. I'd like to begin with a quote from departing Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Over the long term, we cannot kill or capture our way to victory. Non-military efforts, tools of persuasion and inspiration were indispensable to the outcome of the defining struggle of the 20th century. They are just as indispensable in the 21st century, perhaps even more so. And this, quite frankly, was my own guiding principle or idea. As a former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs under President Bush, I spent a great deal of time thinking about such matters, and I concur with Secretary Gates. Persuasion and inspiration are absolutely essential to victory. To achieve our foreign policy goals, we need to take the tools of public diplomacy as seriously as the tools of violence. Public diplomacy is not simply a way to get people to like us better. It's a way to achieve some of the most difficult national security goals that we have. For example, helping to create a free and safe Afghanistan. And I must say that while public diplomacy has been important. It was important in the Bush administration. It's important in the Obama administration. It's not as important as it should be. And I think we learn one aspect of the importance of public diplomacy in this book. And what would make more sense in this struggle than to engage the pervasive influence and impact of religion in this struggle? I immediately, when I learned about Doug's program, I immediately became a very strong supporter. I gave it as much support as I possibly could. And I agree. Doug just said, and I wrote this down, there is nothing more strategic on or off the battlefield than this madrasa program. I completely agree with that. And I think it should get more recognition and more support. So in this book, we're provided with a roadmap for pursuing religious engagement through both governmental and non-governmental channels. Spiritual engagement, as Doug defines it, can be an effective counter to violent extremism. It also represents a compelling vision for public diplomacy. So I just want to highlight briefly 4 essential ingredients of this new form of engagement that also hold true for effective public diplomacy. First, like spiritual engagement, effective public diplomacy engagement begins with respect. When I took my job, one of the things that interested me was what's the source of the animosity toward the United States? And the research shows there are 3 sources. One is that we don't explain our policies very well. Second is when we do explain them, people don't like them anyway. That is to say, they don't like a lot of our policies. And quite frankly, there's not much we can do about that. I don't think that we should change our policies to win a popularity contest. I think that our policies should be well thought through, including the public diplomacy aspects of them. But once policies are set, they ought to be pursued. But it was the third element that I thought we could actually do something about. And that was that many, especially Muslims, felt that we didn't take their views, that we didn't receive their views with respect. It wasn't just that we didn't listen to them. You hear a lot about listening, and listening is important. But it's really respect that's more important. And it's not that we would then adopt the policies that they wanted, but that we would give them a thorough hearing. They understood that ultimately we're going to make decisions that are in America's best interest. But to do it with respect is absolutely essential. So I think that's the first item, spiritual engagement, that relates spiritual engagement to diplomatic engagement. Second, the premise of spiritual engagement is that change can happen only if there is a clear understanding of the challenge. And the ICRD's work in Pakistan's madrasas has succeeded largely because of this understanding of Pakistan's unique religious, educational, and cultural character. I have to say, this is not easy. It takes time. And it's not just Americans. You know, we're frequently criticized for not understanding others' religious, educational, and cultural character. I don't think it's just us. I think it's something that takes time, and we need to respect it. Third, Doug's religious engagement, like our Fulbright exchanges, is built on empathy. It's a wonderful quote from Senator Fulbright, who created the Fulbright exchanges, which, by the way, is where the single most well-supported in financial terms program by the United States taxpayers is the Fulbright exchanges. And this is what Senator Fulbright said: the essence of intercultural education is empathy, the ability to see the world as others see it, and to allow for the possibility that others may see something that we failed to see. That was how Senator Fulbright conceived the Fulbright exchanges. And fourth, the ICRD's groundbreaking work in relating to Iran illustrates the clear untapped potential of religious dialogue as a key to effective communication. This book challenges all of us who care about diplomacy to acquire a sophisticated understanding of other worldviews and the degree to which religious values influence those views. In my written endorsement of Doug's book, I referred to it as shibboleth shattering. I can barely pronounce that. that challenges our long-held assumptions of what effective public diplomacy entails. As creative and committed as our diplomacy is, this book makes a powerful argument that we can do even better by first making religion part of the solution to intractable identity-based conflicts, second, addressing the ideas behind the guns, especially those embedded in religion, and third, moving beyond the rational actor model. You heard Doug use that phrase, of decision-making when dealing with religious imperatives. So we thank you, Doug, for opening the door to a new avenue of diplomacy, for providing us with new tools of persuasion and inspiration, as Secretary Gates put it, and for offering us a better way to deal with the religious dimensions of conflict. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Edwin Meese, who holds the Ronald Reagan Chair in Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation. As I know you all know and respect, Mr. Meese has had a distinguished career as a lawyer, educator, public official, and business executive. He served as the 75th Attorney General of the United States from 1985 to 1988 and held the position of Counselor to the President, where he functioned as Ronald Reagan's Chief Policy Advisor from 1981 to 1985. Mr. Meese, we're very pleased to welcome you to the National Press Club, and we thank you.
It's a great pleasure for me to join my colleagues here and join all of you in this examination of Doug's book and also the great work that he's doing. A military commander or a political leader knows that in dealing with difficult challenges, you have to use every possible means of meeting those challenges. And in dealing with the subject of terror, this means that we have to combine military, diplomatic, political, economic, and indeed cultural resources in contending with what I consider today one of the greatest threats to our country and to people in a peaceful world that we've seen in a long, long time. And so I would like to talk about one aspect that Doug mentioned in his remarks, and that is why religion is so often excluded as one of the resources that we use in meeting these challenges. And as he pointed out, it is a misunderstanding of the idea of religion and the state, which has permeated our culture in this United States, particularly in the last 50 years or so. That misunderstanding was not present 100 or 150 or certainly 200 years ago. Indeed, it is epitomized by a line that is in the book in which a chaplain has been talking to the commander of his unit and has suggested that they provide indirect support to an NGO which has been addressing from a religious standpoint the same challenges that the military unit has been dealing with. And the chaplain said, I have been told repeatedly by members of the staff that they are prohibited from providing support or even interacting with any organization that has religion attached to it. Well, nothing is farther from the truth. We have in this country, in many of our federal departments, a total misunderstanding of what this concept of separation of church and state really is. As a matter of fact, separation of church and state is nowhere found in the Constitution. The Constitution says in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law establishing religion or interfering or infringing upon the free exercise of religion. That's a paraphrase, not an exact quote, but the idea is that it has two parts. That government is to not in any way prefer one religion over another, or as particularly was the case when this was established, create a national church. And it's interesting to note why that, one of the reasons why that provision was put into the Constitution, and that was most of the states at that time, or many of them at least, had state churches, and they didn't want a competition from the national government. But in any event, the idea was that the federal government was not to establish a religion, and inherent in that concept that it would not prefer one religious denomination over another. But nowhere in that idea, nowhere in the concept, and nowhere in any of the expositions of the people who voted for that amendment was the idea that the government should be hostile to religion or exclude religion from its activities. And so that is why we have had this misunderstanding. Now, to be quite honest with you, the courts themselves have contributed to that misunderstanding over the years. But it seems to me that that's a very important point that is made very excellently in this book about what the proper relationship is, and that there is no prohibition against military units, political organizations, State Department, or others from properly using religion and having religion as a means of both understanding the people with whom we are dealing, as well as providing a bridge between peoples. Because in many parts of the world, and really when you look at it in our own history, religion is one of the most fundamental concepts which have to do with people's beliefs, which have to do with the way in which people engage each other, and certainly even how they relate to the state, and the state in turn engages other states and other peoples. And so I would suggest to you that in Doug's book, in addition to all the other very important things which we've already talked about and which you'll learn more about when you read the book, that one of the most important contributions is an accurate depiction of what the proper relationship between the state and religion actually is under our Constitution, and that this is something that will not only be helpful in terms of our dealing with the challenge of terrorism, in our relationships with other peoples, in the success of our people who are on the ground trying to find person-to-person rapport, but also can be a very good model for the entire government to rediscover what the founders had in mind back in 1789 when this particular amendment was passed, and how that can be brought up to date in a way which will permeate the entire government and be a salutary improvement in the way in which we understand the relationship of religion to our government. Thank you.
The Reverend Dr. David McAllister Wilson is president of Wesley Theological Seminary. And as president, the Reverend McAllister Wilson has been instrumental in revitalizing the mainline Protestant church, helping to encourage men and women to consider God's call to ministry and preparing them for leadership. Before becoming president in 2002, he was part of a team that made Wesley one of the nation's largest and leading theological schools, preparing approximately 1,300 men and women for ministry each year. In addition, he helped establish the G. Douglas Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley and co-authored the book, Christian Reflections on the Leadership Challenge. We are very pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. David McAllister Wilson to the National Press Club.
Doug mentioned the rational actor model. I stand here, I guess, representing the irrational world. And on behalf of that world, I want to thank Doug for this book, because it gives voice to a longing that I hear expressed by many people who live and work in and around this beltway, who want to find ways in which their faith might be correlated with their work in the service of the country. One of those individuals came to me soon after 9/11 and asked if he could bring some of his co-workers over and if we could assemble a group of faculty members at the seminary to help him think through a problem. He worked at the Central Intelligence Agency. And at the agency, his working group worked on models for predicting the stability or instability of various regions. And he said, we want to talk with you because we have not included religion in our model. So they came over in a van with the CIO logo on the side. This was not a covert operation. And we had an interesting day of conversation in which I discovered that actually religion was a factor in this model. What was missing was faith. Religion was in the category of culture, I suppose, with sports and fashion. But what was not there was faith. And near the end of the day, I asked, why do you think it is, you very bright people, you had not included this in your model? And they said, you know, we talked about this in the van on the way over. And at first we thought it was the issue of the separation of church and state. But then we realized that was probably not it. That's the veneer that covered the real reluctance. And I said, well, what's the real reluctance? And they said, we unconsciously were avoiding talking about such a subjective thing as faith, because we might have to talk about our own faiths. This book covers both the category of religion, things like what's the difference between a Shia and a Sunni, but more deeply, it deals with the question of what does it feel like to be a Shia or a Sunni, and why would that matter? The book of Hebrews says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Well, what would faith have to do with your worldview, with how you interacted in the public square? Indeed, what are you willing to die for? The specific recommendations of this book are many and interesting, but they're beyond my ability to evaluate on a technical level. Instead, I think the examples you find in this book, examples from Algeria, from the Sudan, from Iraq, and most especially Pakistan, help us have a picture for what organic suasion would look like and feel like. And they're mostly convincing because Doug is himself bilingual. He speaks the language of the defense and intelligence establishment, but he also speaks the language of faith as a practicing Christian. So let me add my word of thanks to Doug for this remarkable book.
Doug, let me just give a general thanks to all of the speakers so far, and to you, Doug. And to you, Doug, for putting together what we call truly a very distinguished panel.